Okay, hi friends, it's Angela Paradisney, continuing the reading of the very difficult to acquire scholarly book, Cover-Up of the Century, Satanic Crime and World Conspiracy by Daniel Ryder, R-Y-D-E-R. In the first two videos on a playlist, I covered the introduction in chapter 1 and 2, and then chapter 3 and 4. So we'll continue now with chapter 5 and probably 6 as well. Please share this, especially with professionals or anybody that really works with children. All right, here we go. Chapter 5. I was recently interviewed by a production team from New Zealand in connection with a documentary they're doing on satanic ritual abuse. The producers explained they've been amazed at the information that has been surfacing since they began investigating the subject. At the time of this writing, the FBI's official, quote, law enforcement perspective is that organized satanic ritual abuse doesn't exist. A report often cited in the media or by the media was issued of the FBI's Academy's National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crime, Quantico, Virginia, in October 1989. The report, Satanic Occult Ritualistic Crime, a Law Enforcement Perspective, was written by Kenneth V. Lanning, MS. The following is a brief excerpt. Quote, rather, a satanic murder can be defined as one committed by two or more individuals who rationally plan the crime and whose primary motivation is to fulfill a prescribed satanic ritual calling for the murder. By this definition, the author has been unable to identify even one documented satanic murder in the United States. Brackets, a similar 1992 update report by Lanning out of the FBI's Quantico unit echoed this statement. New York sacrifice. The following is taken from a Newsday article, a reprint of which ran in the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, February 18th, 1992. New York. Members of a cult here killed ballerina Monica Birla in August 1989 and then dismembered her and fed her flesh to the homeless as part of a satanic ritual, law enforcement sources said yesterday, after arresting a cult member in Pennsylvania in connection with the slaying. After a 29-month search by New York detectives, Randy Easterday was arrested Friday on charges that he and several others helped Daniel Rakovitz, the butcher of Tompkins Square Park, stab Birla and dissect the corpse. Dr. Judy-Ann Denson-Gerber is a New York psychiatrist who also has a law degree from Columbia University and is the founder of PACT, Protect America's Children Today. She's also founder and former chief of psychiatry for Odyssey Institute International, which has drug and other addictions treatment programs around the world. She treated her first ritual abuse client in 1980 and has treated many more since. Quote, the stories about different aspects of the cult rituals are very much the same, whether it's someone from Melbourne, Australia, or Vermont, Utah. This leads me to believe not only are the cults all over, but because of the similarities, many are also networked, said Dr. Denson-Gerber. She also said, commonalities among ritual abuse survivors include, as discussed in the last chapter, amnesia. And many are also drawn to the, quote, helping professions, counseling, nursing, etc., said Dr. Denson-Gerber. One of the unconscious reasons for this, said the psychiatrist, is because some of the ritual abuse survivors were forced to kill during some of the ceremonies or stand by and watch helplessly during the killings. As a result, they are afflicted with, quote, survivor's guilt, as are some war victims, for instance, and they have a strong unconscious need to atone by now trying to help save lives. Some ritual abuse survivor reports include as children being forced to help kill. I refer you to the Hampstead case and the testimony of Elisa and Gabriel. For instance, it's sometimes reported a cult member will put a knife in a young child's hand, then put their hand over the top and force the knife down into a baby that is being sacrificed. The child knows nothing of, quote, coercion to commit a crime and starts to believe they're actually a murderer too. This is a mind-controlled technique to get the child to identify on a deeper level with the cult and encodes the code of silence programming even that much deeper. Going to the source, question mark. To go back to the FBI law enforcement perspective by Lanning. In the updated 1992 version, he writes, quote, many of the police officers who lecture on satanic or occult crime do not even investigate such cases. Brackets, that's not true of the ones I've interviewed. And besides Randy Cerny, a couple other ritual crime investigators, quote, lecturers, extensive work is featured in later chapters. Conversely, and rather ironically, according to a June 1993 Vanity Fair magazine article, writer Leslie Bennett writes of the FBI agent who supposedly has his finger directly on the pulse of this whole issue. Quote, to my surprise, he, Lanning, admits he has never talked to a ritual abuse survivor. Wow. It turns out that through all the years he's been investigating the phenomenon, his contract has been solely with other law enforcement professionals and with therapists. He has never gone to the source of these reports. Brackets, several weeks later, Lanning revised his story to say he had spoken with several dozen survivors on an unofficial basis. Reports increase. Looking Up, founded initially as a support referral program for incest survivors, services approximately 15,000 people a year, 40% of whom are now reporting they are dealing with ritualistic or cult-related abuse. To continue with the missing children phenomenon, former Nebraska State Senator John W. DeCamp, interviewed 28-year-old veteran FBI agent Ted Gunderson for his book, The Franklin Cover-Up, Child Abuse, Satanism, and Murder in Nebraska. Gunderson is the former special agent in charge of the Bureau's Los Angeles division. He also worked extensively on the highly publicized McMartin preschool case in California. In that case, 460 families issued complaints to the Manhattan Beach Police around children's claims of being exposed to ritualistic sexual abuse, animal sacrifice, baby sacrifice, and so on at the preschool. As far as missing children in general, DeCamp writes in the Franklin Cover-Up, quote, evidence from Gunderson's investigations has convinced him tens of thousands of children or young people disappear from their homes each year, and that many are ritualistically sacrificed. Nobody knows what the true figure is because the FBI does not keep count. Gunderson observes, quote, the FBI has an accurate count on the number of automobiles stolen every year. It knows the number of homicides, rapes, and robberies, but the FBI has no idea of the number of children that disappear every year. They simply do not ask for the statistics. I'm convinced that the FBI does not ask for these statistics because they do not want to see them. So they needn't acknowledge, says Craig McGowan, they wouldn't be confronted with an instant public outcry for action because the figures would show a major social problem that would demand action. Internal accountability, says Craig. A detailed report on the Franklin case will be presented in a later chapter. Satanic motivation. Again, as skewed as the ideology may seem, there is rationale for a Satanist behavior beyond merely satisfying some sadistic impulses. A farmer who's also a Satanist in, say, the Midwest, will perform a sacrificial murder for a good crop the next year. If you're a broker Satanist on Wall Street, you may perform a sacrificial murder for a better portfolio. According to an Associated Press article also about the Guaratuba case, quote, police have traced the 7-year-old boy's death to the wife of Guaratuba's mayor, who they say allegedly turned to a satanic cult to try to improve her husband's sagging political and business fortunes. Selena Abaje allegedly paid cult members $2,000 to kill the baby in a good luck ritual. Evil sorcery. It doesn't seem that just the mayoral political strata is using occult rituals. Deposed Panamanian leader General Manuel Noriega was apparently practicing, quote, evil magic and other occult rituals to help himself politically and personally, said agent James R. Dibble, a specialist on, quote, cults and deviant movements in the U.S. Army's Criminal Investigation Division. According to a December 26, 1989 Washington Post article, Noriega used a variety of elaborate rituals to cast black magic spells on numerous political enemies. Also, according to other news accounts that came out at the same time, Noriega was said to have had a ritual altar at his headquarters, and it was reported he regularly consulted with witches. This included a Brazilian sorceress whose photographs hung on the walls of Noriega's home and office. Dibble said the woman practiced candomblé, a Brazilian offshoot of the Latin American religion known as Santeria. Santeria includes a synthesis of some saints and tribal gods and is practiced widely in Latin America. It is similar to, but not the same as, voodoo. The Warrior. I opened the book with a song about ritual abuse from Joan Baez's album, Play Me Backwards. There was another album released about the same time that also includes a song about ritual abuse. The album is The Warrior, a project of recovery. The song, The Saints Will No Longer Allow You to Die, by Trey. Trey, or Trez, said the song was written about a memory given to him by his inner child. While in a treatment center for what was diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder, he began chanting in his sleep. Quote, one of my roommates was an insomniac and wrote down what I was saying as best he could, said Trez. What I was speaking was Latin. I'd never studied Latin before in my life. Trez then started having memories of the nannies who took care of him as a child, practicing Santeria around him. Trez had the chant he was doing in his sleep deciphered by a Catholic priest. What he was chanting was, the saints will no longer allow you to die. Quote, the saints will no longer allow you to die. As I look back on my childhood years, I can recall the times I was so full of fear. I had nannies that took care of me. They were Santeria queens. I think they worshipped me. Oh, how they would chant to the saints as they washed my small feet. I remember what they said as they dried with their hair the blood they put on me. They would sing to me. The saints will no longer allow you to die. That's what my nannies told me. The saints will no longer allow you to die. That's what the Santeria queens would say. The saints will no longer allow you to die. No te dejan morir, mi Diosecito. The saints will no longer allow you to die. They used to sing it every night and day. What was it they were trying to save me from? Was it the devil in me? Or was it something I'd done? I can remember their cries in the night as they gathered round me in the pale candlelight. The saints will no longer allow you to die. Minnesota Mania. In Breaking the Circle of Satanic Ritual Abuse, I write about a 23-year veteran of the Minneapolis Police Department who helped start a groundbreaking task force called MINARA, Minnesota Awareness of Ritual Abuse. John Hinchliffe had been involved with the ritual crime investigation since 1981, when he came across a case that really piqued his interest. A woman in the Minneapolis area had been convicted of murder. She'd been involved in the practice of Santeria, said Hinchliffe. In the Minnesota case, the woman drove blessed stakes, quote unquote, through her young grandson's heart because she felt he was possessed by evil spirits, said Hinchliffe. In the winter of 1988, Hinchliffe and two other counsellors from Minnesota Sexual Assault Center formed MINARA. The membership quickly grew and included counsellors, lawyers, teachers, ritual abuse survivors, other law enforcement officials. Over the years, Hinchliffe said he had developed sources in the occult world. He said that one of the biggest aids to him is that he's been able to gain insight into how cult members think. One of the major obstacles in this field of investigation is the general tendency to just pass the whole thing off as unbelievable, Hinchliffe said, because at first glance it appears so bizarre. However, he said, once you understand some of the rationale, then not only does cult activity become believable, but people are actually able to approach the subject with some measure of objectivity. Murder at Matamoros. Some ritual abuse survivors report witnessing sexual abuse, torture, sacrifice in covert ceremonies, sometimes within the context of such belief systems as Druidism, witchcraft, and again, such Afro-Caribbean religions as Santeria and Palomayombe. Palomayombe is a, quote, dark religion that requires the use of human body parts and blood. It was Santeria and Palomayombe that was being practiced by a cult on an isolated ranch 20 miles west of Matamoros, Mexico, in 1989. And it would be these cult members that would sacrificially kill a Texas college student and 13 others in one of the most highly publicized cult ritual abuse cases yet. 21-year-old Mark Kilroy was in his third year of college and anticipating medical school when he was abducted off the streets of Brownsville, Texas during spring break. He was taken across the border to that isolated ranch outside of Matamoros, and he was sacrificed. The following is an excerpt from the book Sacrifice, which is about the Matamoros case. Constanzo sacrificed Mark Kilroy with a series of machete blows to the top of the head. The high priest then scooped the brains from the college student's skull and added them to the black kettle. Quickly, blood was drained from Mark's body into the cast iron pot. Now, according to the tradition of Palomayombe, the Uganga, quote, dark spirit, had been refreshed with the sacrifice of human blood, even a human life. The group would have power and good luck. The men would have intelligence. They petitioned the spirit for strength, riches, and protection from police while smuggling drugs. After his death, Kilroy's body was mutilated. Even the spine was actually cut free so the cult could use it as a necklace. It would be several weeks later that authorities would make the grisly discovery of Kilroy's body as well as 13 other sacrificed victims at the ranch. In the book People of the Lie, mentioned earlier, author Peck talks at length about psychology of evil, including some people's abilities to spin webs of lies or facades around their exterior to cover the evils they may be perpetrating. Also, at times, the lies become so convincing, people often start to believe the evil they are carrying out is actually good. That is, for a higher purpose. One of the Matamoros murderers, Elio Hernandez Rivera, bragged he could keep a victim alive long enough to split the chest and rip the beating heart out, just as his forefathers, the ancient Aztecs, had done while sacrificing to pagan gods. Another of the Matamoros cult members, Serafin Hernandez Garrea Jr., was actually majoring in law enforcement at Texas Southwest College at the time he was arrested. Note, likewise, Stanislaus County, California, cult member Tamara Smith had been taking law enforcement classes at a community college. Ritual crime investigator Randy Cerny said she was using this to befriend certain police, have sex with them, and glean information the police might be compiling, say, against the cult. This may have also been part of the grooming process in regard to placing cult members in strategic professions. Some ritual abuse survivors report remembering being abused during the ceremonies by cult members that were also involved with law enforcement. According to U.S. Customs agent in charge in Brownsville, Texas, Orrin Neck, quote, "These people, Matamoros cult members, don't seem to know right from wrong. They're convinced that anything they do is right." Also, in the book Sacrifice, authorities described the suspects as being cavalier about what they'd done. There was no apparent remorse or fear. This cult, like the one in California, had a rigid leader, 26-year-old Adolfo Constanza, who ordered the kidnappings and killings. Constanza was also apparently transgenerationally influenced by occult practices. He was an American of Cuban descent, born in Miami, Florida. Growing up, neighbors sometimes complained of dead animals on their doorstep after somehow offending his family, according to the book Sacrifice. Note, several months after the initial reports of the satanic cult killing in Brazil, reporter Todd Lewin filed a story with the Associated Press that provides a more in-depth look at the whole picture. Guaratuba, Brazil. It was 7 p.m., the killing hour. Evandro Caetano, 7 years old, lay gagged and bound to a wooden table in the dark sawmill. Outside, devil worshippers prepared an altar for the sacrifice. Osvaldo Machinero, the cult's, quote, high priest, who later revealed the details of the secret ritual in a videotaped confession, nodded to his followers. Inside the mill, 7 masked figures in red and black circled Evandro. The black and white candles they held filled the room with light. Machinero recalled that the boy wriggled and tried to scream. As the cult leader chanted softly, 2 women pinned Evandro's arms. A man gripped his throat, squeezing until the boy went limp. Another cult member slit Evandro's throat with a kitchen knife and collected his blood in a bowl. With a handsaw, Machinero cut off the hands, ears, toes, and genitals, then removed the eyes, heart. Quote, "A male child of perfect innocence and high intelligence is the most satisfactory and suitable victim," so said Alistair Crowley. Imagine the stark terror of this little boy struggling for his life that night. As he looked up, imploring at the two women who approached him first, what did the young child think? Like his mother, the women would comfort him, help ease his fear, his pain. Instead of comforting looks, what did he see as they reached to hold his arms down? Were the women smiling, laughing hysterically, staring coldly? What if it had only been a cult torture session like so many ritual abuse survivors describe? What if, instead of his throat being slit, the ritual had ended with the high priest folding back the child's eyelid, for instance, and partially slitting the inside? Brackets, a survivor describes this exact torture in my first book, Breaking the Circle of Satanic Ritual Abuse. Would that be enough terror for Evandro's unconscious to repress the memory had he lived? And years later, if the memory came flooding back, would that same Evandro be curled in the corner of a therapist's office somewhere, spontaneous bruises, like what happened with Kathy, appearing on his arms where the women brutally held him down and screaming uncontrollably that scream that was muffled that night so long ago? It's just like so many other cult survivors whose screams didn't come out until years later. How many? Question mark. Work is still being done on that. But the investigation into Evandro's case yields some more clues. The people who killed Evandro were part of a cult called Superior Universal Light, as for example Aleister Crowley's group is called Ordo Templi Orientis. And like Crowley's group, the Superior Universal Light cult is networked, according to Joe Naranja, who is a federal investigator in Panama. According to Lewin's article, Naranja said this particular cult has about 2,000 members and gets donations from around the world, including the United States, South Korea, France, Chile, and Argentina, to commit human sacrifices. What's even more amazing about the Brazil ritual saga is that a group of Guaratuba residents on their own infiltrated the cult and not only learned of Evandro's killing, but also learned another 7-year-old had been abducted and was being prepared for another sacrifice. According to the article, an Argentina couple had paid cult kidnappers $2,000 for this boy. $2,000. This couple subsequently fled, and a search of their house turned up cult registers and Satanist publications. One of the cult infiltrators was Evandro's 36-year-old uncle, Diogenes Quitano dos Santos. Quote, "It was chilling," he said. "It was so crazy, we didn't even know if the police would believe us." One other thing, the high priest that killed Evandro, by day, he administered grade schools and daycare centers for the city. Chapter 6, Daycare Ritual Abuse. There's been an increasing number of reports of ritual abuse in some daycare centers and schools. In Breaking the Circle, there's an interview with a therapist in Northern California who reported being referred 24 children between the ages of approximately 3 and 6 over a period of a year and a half. The therapist, Pamela Hudson, LCSW, was employed at a county children's protective service. Each child was exhibiting, to one degree or another, sadistic impulses, night terror, extreme abandonment issues, sexual acting out behavior. And besides all these commonalities, there was one other. All the children had attended the same daycare center. And what's more, reportedly none of the parents had talked to each other until after they had brought the children in for help. This case was taken to the district attorney's office, said Hudson, but they made a decision not to attempt prosecution. Hudson said she attributes that decision to the lack of physical evidence, the young ages of the children, and the difficulty of making emotionally traumatizing evidence credible to a jury. However, similar cases around the country have now gone to litigation. Texas trauma. Fran's daycare center case bears many similarities to the Northern California case. And what's more, daycare center operators Francis and Dunn Keller have already received 48-year prison sentences for child sexual abuse charges. According to a Cox News Service story, quote, slowly and painfully, the terrible secrets of what happened at the charming daycare home are being revealed. The little children are talking and telling tales of being buried alive with animals, painting pictures with bones dipped in blood, being, quote, shot and resurrected, digging up a body in a cemetery and nailing it together, having giant germs implanted in their bodies, and making pornographic movies at gunpoint. The article went on to explain that police reported some of the children from the daycare center were exhibiting such symptoms as persistent nightmares, acting out sexually, sadistic behavior, and so on. Just remind myself to pray, put on the full armor of God. I just thank you for your protection, Holy Spirit. I thank you, Jesus, for dying that we might live. And I implore that everything I read contribute to the exposure and the arrest of these perpetrators. The initial conviction of the daycare center operators helped empower other parents to come forward and share their children's stories. Again, according to the Cox News Service article, these stories have included the children, 8 of whom are now in therapy, being forced to close their eyes while the Kellers took a meat cleaver and pretended to chop off their fingers. One child peeked and saw Dan Keller pull a bone from a bag and smear it with blood from a jar. The child was forced to paint a picture with, quote, Satan's arm dipped in blood. Watching the Kellers place infants in the backyard swimming pool and letting them sink. Francis Keller would then remove the body from the bottom of the pond, baptize it with blood, and offer it to Satan. The Kellers killing a baby named Rachel by cutting her heart out. One boy said a gun was held to his head while he was forced to molest his infant sister. When the pornographic movie was replayed for him, the gun was not visible, and he realized he'd been tricked. The prosecutor's office had contacted Austin therapist Pam Monday to serve as an expert witness in the case. While she wasn't called, she followed the case closely. Monday has worked with many ritual abuse survivors. In a recent interview, Monday said of the case, quote, what was amazing was there was a conviction. The children were believed, and there will be more. These cases aren't going away. The Cox News Service story, which was written by Denise Gamino and Pamela Ward, also quoted Texas Ranger Johnny Waldrip, who helped out on the investigation. Quote, I believe the kids wholeheartedly, Waldrip says. It's something I've seen before. It's a purposely done thing. Waldrip, says that he believes the children, were subjected to ritualistic acts such as graveyard ritualistic. So when kids start talking about babies being killed and bodies dug up, it discredits them so much no one believes them. Just like perhaps no one believed a group of children in Southern California when they started talking about a secret underground tunnel where the most heinous abuse imaginable was reported taking place. McMartin evidence ignored. The longest trial in American history, California's McMartin preschool case, was one of the first daycare centers involving satanic ritual abuse. Some 460 separate reports were filed at the Manhattan Beach Police Department. The children's stories included sexual abuse, torture, animal sacrifices, baby sacrifices, and being prostituted in private homes and businesses throughout the community. Jackie McGawley's daughter attended the McMartin preschool for 5 months. The girl told of being stripped, tied up, and left in a closet. She talked of watching a man kill a baby. She eventually began experiencing abandonment fears and nightmares where she'd wake screaming, terrified. Variations of these types of stories were told over and over by the children connected to the case, yet in the end, the jury didn't convict. However, some of the parents wouldn't let the issue rest, continuing to try to search out the truth. Quote, where the children said it would be. During the McMartin trial, many of the children would consistently talk about underground tunnels and rooms below the preschool, where a lot of the abuse supposedly went on. A highly qualified archaeologist was hired by the children's families to search for the elusive tunnels. Dr. Gary Stickle, PhD, had worked extensively in the United States and Europe, including heading up the largest underwater archaeological sonar survey ever conducted in Europe. In addition, he's been a consultant to Lucasfilms in the development of the Indiana Jones movie series. He's also past professor of archaeology at the University of California at Long Beach. Stickle reiterated the children had continually talked of the tunnels. So the defense initially hired a private investigator, who in turn went out to the site and did some preliminary informal digging. It's reported, said Stickle, that this investigator found some rabbit bones in the soil. The brackets, the children talked about rabbits being sacrificed. However, the day before he was to testify, the private investigator was found dead from a gunshot wound, said Stickle. It was determined a suicide. But Stickle said the determination was questioned by more than a few people, given the timing, etc. After this, the parents went out and did some informal digging, finding more animal bones. The bones were analysed and showed evidence of trauma, violent death, said Stickle. Shortly after, the site was sealed off. Eventually, an archaeological firm dug 7 pits clustered outside the building. Brackets, this was curious, said Stickle, because the children were reporting some of the major abuse had gone on in tunnels below the building. Stickle said the firm only dug exploratory pits down 6 inches apiece. Wow. What's more, they did find a couple of anomalies, which they wanted to pursue, but Stickle said they curtailed from going any further with these. They also did attempt to use a remote sensing device to check below the school. However, Stickle said the type of device used would be totally ineffective when used within the confines of the building they were working from. To say it was an incomplete job is to put it mildly, Stickle said. And that all happened in 1985. 5 years later, a developer who owned a lot adjacent to the McMartin preschool bought the school property. He allowed the parents access to the site. Under the recommendation of UCLA's archaeology department, Stickle's firm was then hired by the parents. Using sophisticated ground-penetrating radar, Stickle said a tunnel was found, right where some of the children had told his staff it would be. The tunnel extended from near Ray Bucky's, one of the accused classrooms, said Stickle. It was about 3 feet wide, except at one point where it was 9 feet across. Brackets, the children had said there was a room in the tunnels where some of the abuse had gone on. However, even though evidence of the tunnel was found in May of 1990, while the trial was still in progress, the prosecution, surprisingly, never even introduced this in court. Quote, finding such a tunnel was highly relevant to the case, said Stickle, because prior lack of physical evidence of a tunnel, was a major thing used to discredit the children. Stickle again said it is, quote, very questionable why this wasn't introduced in court. Many of the parents felt the same, said Macaulay. This really has a tendency to affect your opinion of how objective the legal system is in presenting a case, Stickle added. The following are some excerpts from a preliminary report about the tunnel findings. 9-foot wide subterranean entrance found under the west wall of Ray Bucky's classroom. Second possible tunnel appears to extend from the bathroom of the office and classroom, number 1, to the front yard of the triplex next door. Front yard concealed from street by 3-car garage. Tunnel features made it evident at least one tunnel was hand dug. Paedophile activists. There is another quite interesting peripheral note about the McMartin case. After the case was completed, the book, Pity the Little Children, The Politics of Child Abuse and the Abuse of Innocence, the McMartin Preschool Trial, was released. In it, authors Shirley and Paul Ebery indicate, amongst other things, that the reports of child sexual ritual abuse in the case were unfounded, and the children had been coerced into reporting the abuse by hysterical mothers and overzealous social workers. The book has been widely cited, seriously reviewed. However, something seems to have been omitted from about the author's blurb. According to an article in the spring 1994 Journal of Psychohistory, Paul and Shirley Ebel were publishers of an underground child pornography journal in Los Angeles called Finger. Also, according to the article, quote, the Ebels have been called, quote, the most prolific publishers of child pornography in the United States by Sergeant Toby Tyler, a San Bernardino, California deputy sheriff, who is a nationally recognized expert on child pornography. Wow. Their kiddie porn material I have seen, and the articles they have published, such as I Was a Sex Pot at 5 and Little Lolitas, included illustrations of children involved in sodomy and oral copulation, and featured pornographic photos of the Ebels. Wow. I contacted Sergeant Tyler to verify the statement. Tyler said during the mid-70s, the Ebels were the most prolific publishers of child pornography in the United States. He said they not only published the magazine Finger, but also Love Magazine and LA Star. Each periodical, said Tyler, contained child pornography. Quote, when the Ebels said they say they have knowledge and expertise in the field of child sexual abuse, I'd have to say I believe them. That is, they've had so much experience exploiting children, said Sergeant Tyler. Wow. Child prostitution. In some daycare center cases, children talk about being taken off-site and into the community to be prostituted for sex. It's important to note here, there's been an explosion of child prostitution around the world in recent years, both behind closed doors and right out in the open. According to a June 21st, 1993 Time magazine report, child prostitution in Russia and Eastern European countries is dramatically rising. And in the third world, some of the staggering estimates include 800,000 underage prostitutes in Thailand, 400,000 in India, 250,000 in Brazil. What's more, in recent years, Europeans, Australians, Japanese, and Americans have flocked to, for instance, Southeast Asia by the thousands to legally engage in sex acts with youngsters. One of Time magazine's stories was about a Russian man that was pimping for several children. He would even dress up one of his young boys as a girl to increase his appeal to deviance. It's important to note here that in the scheme of normal human development, for the first 10 years or so, children have an inbred aversion to sex. They see their parents passionately kissing, and a natural response is a stereotypical yuck. They see an explicit sex scene on TV, for instance, and they get disgusted. They are developmentally and biologically set up that way. Thus, if adults force them to have sex, it dramatically violates their natural physical and psychological boundaries. And consequently, adverse feelings explode inside a child. Anger, nausea, deep sadness, shame. However, at the time of the abuse, it is often not safe to express feelings, and like memories, they often get repressed. Brackets, that's why years later, when the traumatic memories are being recalled, these waves of painful repressed feelings surface as well, often making parts of the recovery gut-fetchingly horrendous. Also, repeated sexual and or ritual abuse destroys a child's self-esteem, as it did with Kathy. This lack of self-esteem sets up the worst possible catch-22 situation for the victim. The lower the self-esteem, the more dependent a child or teen will be on a parent who may also be a perpetrator. Elementary schools. Ritual abuse is not just inherent to daycare settings. It also apparently happens in some elementary schools. The following is an excerpt from Breaking the Circle of Satanic Ritual Abuse. Quote, I'm an adult supervisor of childhood ritual abuse. I wasn't raised by a cult, but was abused by members of a highly organized satanic cult operating out of a rural elementary school. Population of the Midwestern town was 10,000. The abuse took place over approximately a 1-year period when I was 5.5 to 6.5 years old. Years later in therapy, Victoria Light, which is a pseudonym, had memories of being penetrated with a wooden wand while being restrained on a table in the school medical office. She said the school doctor was the head of the cult. Her report goes on, quote, this was not a group of people dabbling in the occult, but an established cult that employed torture, programming, along with animal and human sacrifice. Besides being taken to the school medical office for rituals, I was taken out of school to the doctor's home, to the local mortuary, or to the local cemetery. A member of the local police was involved. The town was infested. Florida findings. The McMartin preschool children weren't the only ones talking about tunnels. Across the country, in Stuart, Florida, children who had attended a Montessori school there were also starting to report sexual abuse, torture, animal sacrifice, baby sacrifice. Some of this also reported to be going on in tunnels below the school. The case in Florida involves the Glendale Montessori School and was investigated by Technology Strategic Planning, Inc. The firm deals primarily with espionage, perpetration, and theft, and has been a consultant for members of Congress, the CIA, the FBI. Technology Strategic Planning is made up of a number of ex-CIA agents, ex-Drug Enforcement Agency agents, and so on. Henry Skip Clements, Jr., Vice President of Strategic Operations, headed up the Montessori School investigation. Figures, mushroom. As in the McMartin case, the horrific stories of abuse started to surface slowly and steadily in Stuart, Florida, eventually mushrooming into a phenomenon that involved as many as 300 children and perhaps many more around the state and even the country. James Toward and his wife Rosario ran the Glendale Montessori School in Stuart from 1980 to 1987. In 1987, 6 children who had attended the school came forward with stories of sexual abuse. This allegedly at the hands of Toward, his wife, and a school secretary. The children's stories were so compelling, said Clements, that a plea bargain was struck. James Toward pled guilty to 4 counts of sexual abuse and 1 count of kidnapping. The secretary pled guilty to 1 count of kidnapping and intent to commit lewd, lascivious, indecent assault. In return, the rest of the investigation was dropped, said Clements. But that's not where the story ended. In the next few years, all types of things started going haywire with some of the town's children, said Clements. Youth suicides and attempted suicides were way up. There were instances of youth trying to kill each other. Some children were being confined to psychiatric units, said Clements. The parents of the 6 original complainants had formed a support group, and as the youth problems kept multiplying, they put together a symposium for parents whose children had attended the Glendale Montessori School. Therapists, teachers, law enforcement, and other concerned adults in the community were also invited. Some 900 people came, said Clements. Clements said he went, quote, and was simply blown away in regards to the details of how heinous the abuse had apparently been, how many children may have been affected, and why more wasn't being done to follow up. After the symposium, Clements said he went to the State Attorney General's office to ask why the investigation had been abandoned. He said he was told that because of the plea bargain agreement, investigations had been stopped. Clements' firm then voluntarily picked up the investigation, and what we soon discovered was our school or community is part of a nationwide cult organization targeting small children, said Clements. Wow. The firm read over thousands of pages of documents of the children telling about what happened. Brackets, this information had been gathered initially by the state attorney's investigator, Larry Lawson. The children talked of sexual abuse, animal sacrifice, underground, quote, rooms being taken off site and being sexually abused by Toward, as well as other community members. A number of children, said Clements, talked about the killing and dismemberment of babies. This was used as part of the Code of Silence programming to keep the children from telling their parents, because it might happen to them if they told the secrets, said Clements. Clements said his firm analysed thousands of pages of phone calls made from the Glendale Montessori School during the 7 years the Towards ran the school. One of the things they found, said Clements, was a significant and quite curious number of phone calls to abortion clinics around the state. Clements said he surmised that's where some of the, quote, dismembered babies came from. Note, I recently viewed a picture of a dismembered 21-week-old fetus after a DNA dilation and evacuation. Dilation and evacuation, DNC we call it in England. Abortion procedure. His arms and legs had been dismembered, apparently as part of the procedure. If such a fetus baby were doctored, and if it were staged right, it appears you could fool young children in a ritual setting. Clements also said his firm found a substantial amount of phone traffic from the school to Mexico, Puerto Rico, Canada, and the Netherlands. Clements said a reporter for one of the Miami newspapers traced one of the calls to a publishing company in Canada that produced pornographic materials. Clements also said a number of children talked about being photographed naked. Based on this data, Clements said he believes Toward may have been part of a pornographic ring. However, he said he believes Toward had been warned before the warrants were served, and if there was evidence of pornography, it had been taken from the school prior to investigators showing up. Technology Strategic Planning noted numerous calls to other Montessori schools around the state. The firm also obtained records of Toward's MasterCard receipts and was able to track him to these other schools. One such school, said Clements, is in Ormond Beach, Florida. Clements said Toward had apparently been visiting the school and staying overnight. Brackets, there were calls to the owner of this school. As the firm investigated further, Clements said they discovered some 30 children in Ormond Beach who had attended the same Montessori school there were experiencing the same extreme abuse symptomology and telling some of the same stories as the children in Stewart. Children in both Florida schools, said Clements, talked about underground tunnels and rooms below the foundation of the schools, just like in the McMartin case. Clements said Toward went to prison in 1989, and his firm didn't pick up the investigation until 1992. He said they are currently trying to get federal help to have access to do a search for the tunnels. Clements said one day in the midst of the investigation, he was visited by an FBI agent who wanted all the information the firm had gathered in the case. Clements said he refused, then inquired of the agent why the FBI hadn't followed up on the case themselves. According to Clements, the FBI agent said that because the, quote, official agency stance is ritual abuse of this sort doesn't exist, based on an often cited report by the FBI's Ken Lanning mentioned earlier, the agency seldom follows up on such cases. Because of that report, said Clements, agents coming out of the FBI Academy in Quantico didn't get any training in this form of ritual abuse, and he believes are subsequently at a distinct disadvantage when a case like this comes up. Note, Lanning's 1992 FBI report states, quote, until hard evidence is obtained and corroborated, the public shouldn't be frightened into believing that babies are being bred and eaten, that 50,000 missing children are being murdered in human sacrifices, or that Satanists are taking over America's daycare centers or institutions, end quote. California's Monarch Resources reports that a recent University of New Hampshire research study shows for a one-year period there had been 270 daycare center sexual abuse cases reported just in the United States, involving 1,600 children. Some 15% of these cases also involved allegations of ritual abuse. Quote, this is so bizarre, said an exasperated Clements. Here we are with the big problem. Countless children are being hurt, and no one will help. During the course of his firm's investigation, Clements said he consulted with a US customs agent. Clements said this agent is considered extremely knowledgeable about ritual abuse issues. During their talks, Clements said the agent relayed that his department had been investigating similar ritual abuse reports from schools in Kentucky and Mississippi. Children connected to these schools were also reporting secret tunnels, sexual abuse, animal sacrifice, mind control, said Clements. Some of the children were also reporting being flown to jungle areas in places like the Bahamas and photographed for pornography. Before the department finished the investigation, it was disbanded, added Clements. Wow. Federal Commission. Clements said there is no federal agency that is currently targeting looking into ritual abuse of children. In the pornography area, including child pornography, Clements said the only agency having success in curtailing that flow is the US Postal Service, which he said claims they have cut down pornography some 85% in recent years. Clements explained child pornography had been largely produced overseas, yet a substantial amount is consumed in the United States. Brackets, child pornography is now a multi-billion-dollar business. Also, according to the June 21st, 1993 Time magazine article, in Germany, for instance, annual sales of kiddie porn are estimated at $250 million. This is in the 90s. And the number of consumers between 30,000 and 40,000. Clements added, while the US Postal might have cut the importation of pornography dramatically to America, the demand hadn't been curtailed. So now he said he believes much of the pornography is being generated domestically. And he cites the children's stories surfacing all over the country about being used in pornography as examples. Clements believes that child abuse must be targeted at the federal level. He has recently written to members of Congress trying to generate interest in establishing an office in Washington that would oversee and coordinate efforts among the FBI, US Postal, CIA, Department of Justice, and any other agencies that could have an impact on helping investigate and stop all forms of child abuse, including ritual abuse. How many children have died already? Asked Clements. Clements said he vows to keep fighting this and is not intimidated by what he believes he's up against as far as a ruthless, sophisticated, organized crime cult ring. If they want a war, we'll give them one, said Clements. Clements said that since his firm has taken up the investigation, he's had conversations with a number of US Customs field agents that have also come across similar cases, and they keep encouraging me to keep going on this. More cases. In the late 80s, Pamela Hudson, LCSW, became a pioneer in working with child ritual abuse victims. She devised a questionnaire and pulled a group of parents involved in litigation in cases of purported ritual abuse around the country, polled. Using her questionnaire, Hudson did telephone interviews with parents whose children were involved in the McMartin case and in similar cases in San Francisco and New Jersey, and in a satanic ritual abuse case in California involving a babysitter. She also talked with parents in Texas and Oregon. In all, she interviewed one set of parents from 10 cases across the country. In the findings, she also included data from the case she'd worked with. No matter where in this country or in the country the abuse had taken place, the children demonstrated many of the same post-traumatic stress symptoms: night terrors, fear of the dark, extreme abandonment fear. Many reported being photographed during the ceremonies. Of the 11 alleged victims, 10 reported being threatened with guns and knives, and 9 reported watching people being killed as part of the ceremonies. Brackets, a full report on these findings is included in Hudson's book, Ritual Child Abuse. Hudson also said the similarities in these cases across the country are not only alarming, but an indication that perpetrators actually follow prescribed rituals that are fairly consistent and calculated. What's more, she said the types of torture and mind control reported to her by children derived from conditioned response techniques reportedly developed for use with political prisoners or prisoners of war. These include sensory deprivation and physical tortures such as electric shock or forced drug-induced states. Presidio problems. Investigative journalist Roy Blake, in his book Objective Evil, Satanic Cults in US Intelligence, I think that's the book I'm looking for, or Craig is looking for. If anybody has a PDF or a copy of that, please contact me. Chronicles reports of daycare sexual ritual abuse at San Francisco's Presidio Army Base. According to Blake's research, there were 59 alleged child victims claiming various forms of sexual abuse, being forced to consume urine and feces, and having blood smeared on their bodies. In some cases, reports Blake, children said that guns had been pointed at their heads and the lives of their parents and other loved ones had been threatened if they talked. A 3-year-old boy, who was the first to report the abuse, was taken to San Francisco General Hospital, where a doctor examined him and concluded the boy's anus had been traumatized in a manner consistent with penetration, Blake reported. Quote, the doctor's conclusion precipitated a number of meetings at the Presidio, which was characterized later by some sources as more concerned with damage containment than an effort to protect the children still in the Presidio childcare center. Indeed, it was nearly a month after the incident before the Army saw fit to notify parents whose children were still being seen at the Presidio childcare center, wrote Blake. In this particular case, as the children started to come forward, they also talked about being prostituted in houses on and off base. One of the homes being that of Temple of Satan leader, Colonel Michael Aquino, reports Blake. Among the more bizarre findings at Aquino's house, said Blake, was a room with all black walls and another room that was soundproofed. Blake also notes San Jose Mercury news reporter Linda Goldston found evidence that satanic activities were not new to the Presidio. According to Blake's book, in the early 1980s, a then military policeman stationed at the Presidio recalled he received a call from the Porter and MacArthur housing area where witnesses reported a man dressed in black was leading a little girl somewhere. The witness apparently became concerned when they heard screams nearby. Although they were unable to locate either the girl or the man dressed in black, while in her hot pursuit, the MPs kicked open the door of a gardener's shack and discovered a huge pentagram painted on the floor and such bizarre accessories as a mannequin with a gun pointed at the door and the heads of the dolls. Note, again, as mentioned in Kathy's story, ritual abuse investigative experts say besides the authentic torture and killings, there also might be a lot of smoke and mirror tactics used by the cult to intimidate children. A mannequin pointing at a gun at a doll's head in the shadows would look awfully real to a child, as would, say, a knife buried in a baby doll smeared with animal blood. New Zealand nightmare. Several years later, and thoughts of miles away from San Francisco, thousands of miles away from San Francisco, children at a daycare centre in Christchurch, New Zealand, were reporting much the same sexual ritual abuse stories as the children from the Presidio. Daycare staff member Peter Ellis, 35, was eventually sentenced to 10 years in prison for sexual violation and indecency involving 7 of the children who attended the daycare centre between 1986 and 1992. As in other daycare cases, the parents banded together for support, and the conviction in no way ended the saga. the scars cut deep. One of the parents, in fact, started an End Ritual Abuse newsletter to give affected parents a forum to air their feelings and to warn others. According to one grandmother, when the stories initially started to surface, quote, "We felt confident that Mary," her granddaughter, "could not have been involved, for we surely would have known. That was before we knew if the threats would ensure that the children remained silent. I will always remember the shock of being told. I was sickened, angry beyond imagining at the abuse itself, and by the betrayal of trust by everyone at the crash daycare center. In successive months, I too lost my innocence. As more and more details came to light, I learned more about sexual abuse of children, ritual abuse, child pornography rings, and sex tourism. If this relative and others were shocked at all this, imagine some of their feelings when New Zealand Sunday Star Times ran a front page article on June the 5th, 1994, about Peter Ellis now writing children's books from his prison cell. Ugh. According to the article, the parents of one of the children found to have been abused by Ellis are furious over the books, especially Pretty Flowers, which is about an evil witch who captures a group of young children. It's dangerous material because it's full of triggers and reminders for the children that have been abused, said one mother. It's life imitating his real life, the sick, childish ramblings of a convicted paedophile, a father of an abuse victim added. It would take a brave publisher to publish the books. To go back to the End Ritual Abuse newsletter, the grandmother went on to say, however, when I spent a horrendous evening watching videos of TV programs on child abuse and pornography and saw how similar this Christchurch case was to others in this country and overseas, I discovered again the anger I needed to start writing. For me, it's terribly important that the children's stories are not just believed, but also told to the world. I'll leave it there for now. I'll pick up at chapter 7 next time. Angela Power Disney on YouTube and Facebook. AngelasCashes.org is my blog. No apostrophe, and Cashes is spelled C-A-C-H-E-S. I'll put some links in the description box. Please share this.